thank you for coming back on time and everything. Let's talk about on time. So this is our third point. We're on 3 of 4 already. We've done rigorousness, of which you are all experts. We've done actionability, of which you are now experts. And now we're going to do some advice for keeping things on time. And when I went to dinner with your lovely lecturers yesterday, it was proposed that I should talk about what on time means. How quickly does the research, play research does, get turned around? And by extension, how quickly will you have to work? So, in 3 numbers, here's what we do. Play research works by booking individual pieces of research with a game development studio. So they'll come to us, I'll design a method with them, and we'll book it in. And that's going to be booked in roughly 6 weeks in advance, give or take. So 6 weeks from today, I'm booking pieces of work. 2 weeks before that piece of work is due to start, we should have that document I talked about, the research aims document. We should also have an idea of the playtester cohort we're going to bring in. Who are the playtesters? What are we going to do? We should have sessions designed, how long we're going to play for. And we should start the recruitment process for those testers. 2 weeks before. So it's T minus 6 weeks, T minus 2 weeks. T minus 1 week. No, sorry. 2 weeks later, we're expected to have that deliverable. On average, play research's work gets turned around in 1 week, in 5 working days. It means we get a build on the Monday, the build we're going to test, and the report goes out on Friday. So when I say on time, this is the pace I'm talking about. So we have to balance the speed of development, which is to say, how quickly changes are being made, how much we can slow down to wait for results, etc., with the need for rigor. As I already talked about, but I had an example plan to talk about, there is less scope for change over time. So in addition to being able to turn work around quickly, we also need to time the work right in the development schedule. So we're not learning about things that we can't change. We are doing the right work at the right time to get the insight that we can in an actionable, rigorous way, whilst we have time to fix it if it's wrong. Go ahead.
So with that 6-week time frame, you're saying that the 1 week is when you do most of that work.
Yeah.
What about things like pilots? Do you have time for pilots?
No. That's another slide. Very good, thank you. No, there's no time. There's no time and there's ways around that. So for very large studies, 30, maybe not even that. Actually, it's more like for weird studies, where I've designed a method or where there's a group have designed a method, we'd probably run some sort of pilot. And if it's otherwise extremely likely that there's going to be some weirdness in the methodology, like in-home testing or, I don't know, some convoluted within subject thing.
And does that happen in that first 4 weeks then?
No, that all happens in the, well, I decide, because I define the research, right, so I get to decide how it works, but what's breathing down my neck is this desire to be as fast as we can, because 1 week, 2 weeks is likely the game has changed so much, there's a risk that the game has changed so much that what we're talking about is inactionable. Right? I talked about, just to the folks in the corner, I was talking about the lack of, that game development is a bit behind in terms of product management, software design, like games use researchers, game development, not really using agile because they don't feed user feedback into it. And I'm not a project manager, so I can't talk to that, but there is a need for an increase in maturity. As a result of that, let's say, focus on speed, on pace, there's often less time to run research. Go ahead.
So again on the time, so like a couple of projects, or most of the projects I did, like a consulting project, the developers say, I'm going to send you the build on Monday, but then Monday morning, this thing with the really sorry, we haven't finished the build the way we wanted, can we send it next week? And in the way that you book your time, how do you deal with those scenarios? Or they send you a build and then they're supposed to implement something that it was crucial to your test, and you get the build and you see that piece is not there yet, and then they send a piece of paper with it that, oh, here is the controller, we didn't make it to the game, but show it to them.
Right. There's so many answers to that question, I'll try and do my best. Firstly, I would ask Audrey that tomorrow, because Audrey, who you'll meet tomorrow, who is wonderful, she has worked within one project. She's embedded research. She's worked in one project for a long time, so she's had. There are reasons why that would cause more scenarios like this to happen. Certainly you'd be more exposed to those scenarios behind the scenes. How does play research prevent against those scenarios? How do I put this politely? We charge a lot of money. We're an expensive company to work with, and that means we get taken very seriously, which is not to say that your commercial endeavours were any less or more. There is a certain beneficial authority demanded by working with a third party. That means that maybe things are more likely to come in on time, which isn't to say the project's done. Secondly, it's a factor of preparedness and communicating our expectations on behalf of the research. So working with the stakeholders, back to the slide we talked about earlier, working with all the stakeholders at different managerial levels to really understand whether it's likely that the game is going to come in one piece or not at all, or in many pieces. And thirdly, maybe, I don't know where this fits, but preparedness in terms of like, what's our plan B? What are we, we've got these research questions which may get what we want to answer. How many of them can we answer with what we have? So trying to diversify the research questions, if we can, to account for any variability. The most common scenario actually I enter here is that developers, because there's maybe a bit low understanding of UX maturity, there's a lesser appreciation of what can be tested with a build that's in that sort of shape. And in many cases, people naturally would want to make sure something's perfect before they test it, like, I'm still working on it, it's not right, it's not ready. Actually, in conversation with an individual team, you might find actually the game is perfectly ready to test the controls, but not at, I don't know, level 10 or whatever. So there's often, it's just a communication process where we unwind together what actually is possible, even though we don't feel the game is ready. You want to answer? Sorry, the next question. Cool. I'm going to go through those, but let's do it one at a time. So we need to turn around individual research projects real fast and reliably. And the way we do that is to rely very heavily on templated methods. The reason we don't have to run pilot studies is because we've run so many usability tests to a specific defined format that any member of my staff could run with their eyes shut. We have a menu of services predefined in almost every sense. So the number of players, the length of the play session, the amount of time spent for preparation, preparation, testing, and reporting. They are off of a menu to the point where developers actually start asking, we want one of those usability play tests. It's a 2-2-2. And a 2-2-2 means 2 days prep, 2 days testing, 2 days reporting. And there starts to be a common nomenclature formed. So these templates are really valuable for increasing maturity, but also just for making sure that we're not caught off guard. We always work in teams of 2. Always. No research is left on one individual researcher. That means that there is always essentially a readiness for workload to change or increase. And there's never it's never run on one person working super hard. There's always a team of 2, and they can escalate between each other, although there is a lead researcher who ultimately controls the project, who, by the way, is not always the most senior of the 2. That responsibility and role does change. A point I touched on earlier. In order to turn around research projects quickly, it's imperative to control the scope creep. Those questions I talked about, the nice to know stuff, unless I can start taking those off the table, the project is going to bloat. We're going to start having to ask lots of questions about would you buy this, or lots of questions about the art style that are just simply nice to know. So there is a need to constrain. Otherwise, the project is going to get far, far more data capture than we can possibly do. Okay. A minute to capture in there. Okay. Okay. We need to schedule research at the right milestones too. So we're talking about the other on time here, where we're thinking about when to schedule. And again, we're back to this idea of a menu of research services. It's much easier to think about what is needed when, if we already have defined what is needed, right? If we have a starter and a main course and dessert, it's much easier to decide what you want, and it's just a big, bundle of stuff you can have from the menu. And that's what we've very deliberately done. It's divided Player Researcher services up into things, individual methods that you can ask for. Usability playtest, expert analyses, longitudinal diary study, analytics services. By drawing boxes around what those individual methods are capable of, we can help teams think about when they could be implemented. And because they are self-evident in their constraints, usability tests look at usability, it's much easier to define when it is suitable to inject those into the development process, which otherwise, as I proposed earlier, is complete and utter chaos. By extension, then, it's necessary to understand the strengths of each method. And we're back to that first piece of advice I gave, where really understanding the tools that are in your toolbox is paramount at this stage in your careers. I'm going to skip that one and talk about this instead. I think there's a vision, there's sometimes perhaps an over-glamorization of the development process, an over-rationalization in some of the retrospectives you'll watch on GDC and YouTube and articles and things, where it sounds like from the outside that game development was this lovely, wonderful journey where we all knew what we were doing at all times and just sort of sailed towards a product and we shipped it and it was a success. And that's absolutely fundamentally untrue. Most games are a mess and they're really, the fun doesn't really come together until the last minute, and that's fine, that's where creativity shines. But you must reflect that in your considerations of, well, what does on time mean then? What does having something on time mean when I don't know where I'm going to be and when? So there needs to be a plan, and maybe this is one step above what you're thinking about right now, but you can design your methods and your research around scope change. So if the bill doesn't come in, we can still run the study with some efficacy. And that should be as part of your research design process. Okay. What do I want to talk about here? In the Games User Research book, there's a model you should read this chapter, I guess. It was written by Brennan Castle. It's about how research is executed over the course of development. And we use this model. This is a piece of it, it's not the whole thing. Where we talk about how one needs to explore learnability, whether players understand something, before usability. Because the players can't do unless they understand what they're doing. And there's a need to explore learnability and usability before we explore player experience. Because if players don't know what they're doing and they probably can't execute it very well, then they're probably not going to have a fun time. And I'll let that chapter talk its talk, because it's written to explain this process, but setting realistic expectations and a narrative around what order we're going to test things in is paramount. So yeah, go ahead and read that chapter. I haven't talked too much about the deliverable formats, and actually came up over lunch, over our break there. In that, maybe I don't know if it's clear how we deliver this insight at all. I'm sure you're thinking about graphs and charts, but from player researchers' perspective, we're quite maybe a bit different. I don't know. We deliver essentially just a slide deck, but it's a bit text heavier. It's got lots of images. It's reasonably visual, and we'll break down the game. I guess you've got examples to show. So you'll see how we break down the game. Often in prose, basically. Bits of the UI is circled. This is a problem. Is this? Issues are prioritised: high, medium, low. We prefer that PDF format, the digital delivery format, because for lots of reasons, it meets the expectations of our clients. It's persuasive, and it matches a lot more development studios' processes than trying to mirror their internal tools. You should ask Audrey tomorrow, well, how do you deliver your reports to the team or your results to the team? See her answers. I propose she'll have a very different answer and consider PDFs to be antiquated, and I don't disagree. Deliverables, nonetheless, are completely changeable. And there are many schools of thought about what makes a good deliverable format. For example, there are teams that only deliver the results by presentation. They will never write, don't have to write much, maybe just write a few slides and then come and talk to the team, much like I'm talking to you now, and go through the results of the game, which requires everybody to be in the same room and to sit and listen, of course, as it's done. There are teams that only have dashboards. There are teams that put their results straight into Jira, which is an issue tracking tool, J-I-R-I, Jira. It's an issue tracking tool for engineers. I'm sure there are many other methods of delivering reports too. This is inside your control. And it's as a researcher's potentially among your responsibilities to define what deliverable we think will be most effective, most on time perhaps, what's quickest, maybe what's most persuasive is also important. We can come to that next. So we can present, we can maybe run a workshop, we can write lots of text. There's teams that work in video. We've certainly delivered results exclusively via video in the past. There are teams sending email newsletters as well, emailing around the whole team. And there's a team called Nordius based in Serbia who gleefully told me that they were starting to put up their usability playtest results in the toilets, or the staff toilets, because they were going to where the developers were. They were bringing the results to the developers instead of the developers to the results. I think it's fascinating and wonderful in every way. There's something to be learned from advertising. Maybe there's a reason that the chaps have got advertising business. All right. At the risk of sounding overly summative and smug, your research is only ever as good as your ability to communicate it. Again, thinking back to that statement earlier, your results only have value if they have impact. They're inherently valueless otherwise. By extension, it's only ever as good as your ability to communicate that to the team quickly and persuasively. Okay. And sort of by extension, I talked about iteration and how we're doing lots and lots of tests over and over again, and that's different to what you're doing now, maybe. I don't know. For player research, it's been very important for us to maintain a culture of continuous improvement, such that we can bring down the amount of time it takes us, or maybe just do more with the same amount of time. So conducting research retrospectives, for example, looking back at the lessons learned and trying to centralise those. Again, these are weird responsibilities that maybe we're not thinking about enough as researchers, or maybe not. I can't speak for you. There's a wonderful podcast called Mixed Methods, which you should all absolutely listen to every episode of. It's a user experience research dedicated podcast called Mixed Methods, presented by a lady named Ariel Siankmo. It's one of the best user experience research resources on the internet, in my opinion. There's a particular episode from LinkedIn, talking with LinkedIn researchers, about their continuous improvement processes. They run feedback workshops as part of their staff kind of centralised improvement and training, and it's wonderful. You should listen to it. It's great, and hopefully it will inspire you to the need for continuous improvement and maybe what methods of doing that. I don't know if this is the sort of thing that's inside your remit today. Can you be doing this as student researchers? I don't know, but I'd like to be thinking about it. That would be great. All right. Any questions on time? I've jumped around with lots of different subjects. It's fine to feel like some of that was unclear. Go ahead.
What's the consequence of not doing that? So does that ever happen?
Yeah, of course. I mean, deadlines overrun. We've done this hundreds of times, right? So that's not to say we know exactly how to do it. What's the scariest part of being on time? I guess waste opportunity cost, I guess. If the game changes so much in that period, or you're too late for the game, that research time is wasted because it's inherently valueless. I mean, not all of it, but probably some core part of it. And that's money. It's just money down the drain. It's money and time and goodwill and and the emotional side of that as well. Did the team work long hours to get the bills? That's our sort of turnaround time. Side of our own time is. In terms of our scheduling, what happens if you just find, what happens in that diagram if we just come way late? Too slow. What happens if we just come way late in the process and we can't change it? Well, again, I think it's always better to know. If there's a big problem with the game and we only find it out here, when we've got no time to change it, is it better to know? Probably. At least the company can make an informed decision about delaying the game or cutting features, or I don't know. But it's a point of failure, isn't it? It's a failure at that point. And that's what risks negative reactions to that, like crunch or forced overtime, or any of these horrible reactions to finding out something we didn't know, or there being a quality problem. I'm not going to talk about that stuff because I'm disconnected from it. But let's not pretend that doesn't happen, and it happens all the time. Not least because, as I mentioned, like, things don't really start to get fun until quite late. None of this stuff is really that fun. It's fun for game designers, you can think about fun, but for players, maybe things just aren't fun for quite an uncomfortably long time, potentially. So there's always going to be fun questions. There's going to be fun questions throughout, but only when we can start answering them with just data like that suddenly sounds a bit scary start arising. And that is different for every project, of course. All right. Persuasiveness. Just because your data is rigorous and actionable and delivered on time does not mean people won't ignore it. Companies, individuals, or otherwise make irrational decisions all the time. And I think particularly in game development, it's important to recognise that you have to ignore feedback. You have to be able to ignore people telling you that's not very good, or they don't like it. For the exact reason I happen to have just mentioned, that games aren't fun for a lot of the time. It's simply not going to be that good looking, it's not going to be that exciting, there's going to be maybe a few minutes of gameplay, there's going to be a boring level made of grey boxes, there's going to be a lot of negative feedback and negative worries and concern flying around the studio, and having a thick skin is therefore essential. So how do we operate inside an environment where ignoring feedback is part of the process? That's really hard. Hence this fourth and final condition or trait of good data is persuasiveness. It has to be made clear that the data you provide is not only rigorous and actionable on time, but needs change. Must be changed now, not tomorrow, not next week, not next month. Today. By extension, knowing when to ignore your own feedback is important too. And maintaining, again, we're harking back to this research scope creep and people wanting to ask about fun factor all the time and having worries about whether the game is fun. Protecting, if you have a persona of a trustworthy, persuasive, rigorous individual in the company, which you should do because you're a researcher, like recognizing that you're persuasive and not giving bad data, like not providing that to the team is also part of your role. Did I make that? I don't know if I made that clear. If you're the harbinger of good data, you better be really careful of bad data because it's going to be communicated to you persuasively. So recognizing that persuasiveness is a trait is really important. Any questions about this? I don't know if I can explain that well. Oh, okay, right, we'll move on and we'll see how we go. Okay. Let's talk about what makes, hurdles that fledgling researchers trip up over when they're talking about, when dealing with persuasiveness. As a fledgling researcher, I propose that it's extremely difficult to understand where user research feedback stops, and game design starts. because there's a lot of crossover. Especially, there's UX design as well. There's a different discipline in here, thinking about the user, talking about the user. The way that, I don't know if it's a useful way to think about it, but the idea is that game designers design the friction. They decide what is going to be tough, what is going to be difficult to do, hard to execute. Where are we going to put barriers in the player's way? Because it's hard to do something, hard to think about something, hard to time something, maybe all of those things at once. The game designer is designing that friction, and they're playing with it, trying to make a toy out of it. The games user research team and the UX design team are trying to find other sources of friction that aren't among that toy and remove them. All that's left by that process is the friction we designed. Have I made that clear? Does that sound okay? Anyone disagree with that? Do you have interest? Okay. That has painted a picture of a very clear choice where it's like, well, that's game design and that's player feedback, and there's never the twain shall meet. Obviously, that's not true, because a designer saying this level is very hard, we're going to design this level to be a complex puzzle. Okay, well, how many times should the player die? How long should they take to complete it? There are research questions around that. We need to try and quantify the friction. But it is not within our remit to say, this level should be, what's the best example to give here? Watertight example. This game would be better if is not the voice of the game's user researcher. This could be more fun if, because designing that friction is someone else's role, defining that friction is ours. The easiest way to make yourself unpersuasive, to stop you being listened to, is to start talking about game design. Inexpertly, like a bull in a china shop, because probably none of us are game designers, maybe there are game designers here, at which point you should be telling me what game design is, I guess. Is to inexpertly discuss or try and influence game design. At that point you can't be trusted, because you're trying to exert your own creative influence over the title, and you cannot be trusted to maintain impartiality that's required for research feedback. Go on. I'm not getting enough questions, so I feel like I'm definitely not being clear enough here. Go on.
No, yeah. So one of the things that I usually struggle when I do consulting work is that thing. So when I write a report, where do you stop? Do you try to just say, this is what the player said or felt, and leave it to the design team or the developer themselves to figure out the solution?
I think so.
Would you suggest some ways that may solve the issue that you observe?
So that's one of the responsibilities of that preparation stage of the playtest. I talked about a 2-2-2 as our nomenclature. Maybe don't talk to Audrey about that. That's just us that used up here numbers. The 2-2-2 test is 2 days of preparation, where we're trying to actually play the game and understand the friction that's being designed. Trying to kind of imbibe the game design. What is this game about? Tell me about where the friction comes from. Learning through the game, through playing the game in a structured way, what we think is design friction and what isn't. And of course we'll talk to the development team as well. Your question is about how far do we go?
Like in the report, do you document your design suggestion?
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestion on how to approach?
I do. But let's talk about whether we should do that or not first. If you're going to have direct access to the developers, to the designers of this experience, and they should know or may know, you can just ask them, hey, tell me about the vision you have for this. Is this supposed to be hard, supposed to be fun? If you can't garner it from the experience yourself. If you know what an experience is supposed to be, then you have a platform to give either suggestions or advice or critique. If you don't know, the best deliverable is a question. So among our reports, we have issues and we have questions. Issues are prioritised, high, medium, low, and questions are just called key questions. So if we don't feel we know the experiential intent, I'm just going to write in our deliverable a question. What do you anticipate players should do here? How long should they last? Tell me how many times they would die. I don't know. The individual varies. Ask the question. You don't have to say. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes just asking the right question is enough. if you're certain that you know the design intent, so in the other condition where you know the design intent, and if the game isn't performing to that, then go, use your best practice. Use your knowledge of design to say, oh, these things, this design isn't working because the buttons are unclear. It's not capturing players' attention enough. And I know how to do that, because those are just HCI principles. The prior step was the important one, knowing what the intent is.
So your design suggestion would basically telling them where the issue, what's the source of issue, rather than like you would say that they didn't do this because the button wasn't clear,
Sure.
rather than saying that they didn't do this, please change the color to red because that makes the button
Yes,
clear.
yeah, right, because that's actually two separate statements. Like, do you agree with this, that this is a problem? Do you agree that this is the cause of the problem? And then, do you agree that this suggestion would address the cause of the problem that I proposed? But you've shown you're working out, like a math problem. You've shown, 3 times that. You've shown, and then if the developers don't agree with your logic, they can just take a step back and go, oh, actually, that button's the problem. It's this. And we've got other fixes for this, but because you've shown your workings out, that you're not becoming confusing or arrogant or coming across as naive or wading into game design, because you've shown how you can be trusted to work through a problem in a logical way. And that's a critical difference between us and game designers, that we can work backwards through human experience like that. This design caused, this reaction caused, this consequence caused, this second order consequence caused all of this behaviour that we do or we don't want. We can work backwards through that in a rational way. Do I get there?
Yeah.
I can't stress this enough. Let the designers design. Game designers have design backgrounds for a reason. You shouldn't talk about game design unless you're doing so very carefully, deliberately. Nobody wants fashion advice from their dentist. You need to stay within your remit. Unless you're, and then at some point you can disagree and deliberately disagree with that statement. I'm not saying that's forever true for everyone. Go on.
Yes. These are very interesting. So one question I usually get when working with people, then they feel that if you don't make design suggestions, they didn't really get the value of their money. They were like, oh, since you identified the issue, why don't you also kind of suggest a few solutions?
I'm going to make you define design. What design are we talking about? We're talking about interaction design, or we're talking about game design?
I would say interaction design in most cases.
So not all problems are caused by interaction design, but if you found a problem that's caused by interaction design, and you can't persuade the team that that's the answer, then you're not doing a good enough job. The idea that because you're not giving game design suggestions is obviously moot because you're not talking about game design. But we're not game designers. If you talk about yourself being a game designer and give the expectations of the team you're going to give game design suggestions, everyone's going to have a bad time. That's not what you deliver. So understanding the voice of what you're going to deliver is really important. Setting expectations, speaking to the stakeholders, being careful of scope creep, maintaining a dialogue of what you're going to do, what is our agreement. Even whether or not you provide suggestions is a really controversial topic. And it makes me uncomfortable even speaking about it, actually. It's very, very controversial whether we should be giving suggestions to teams at all. Even comfortable best practice design suggestions that are just based on human cognition. Right? Obviously that's nonsense, and we should absolutely be sharing everything we know about design because we're passionate about it and we know about it. If you can steer clear of design. If you're not, in my opinion, Persuasiveness, I guess it's by extension, we usually give suggestions to every issue, but they're carefully constructed suggestions that maintain our view. Okay? Right. We talked about that, and talked about that, and talked about that. And the first rule of game design is not to talk about that. Okay. Persuasiveness. Okay. There's nothing like stakeholders attending in person. So, at a high level, which I'm talking about, it's all I've done is talk about high level stuff, I'm sorry about that. It's much easier to just ignore your feedback or let someone else deal with it, or let that thing happen and I'll just get the report. But actually, cultural change and persuasive data comes from watching players do things. There's nothing like stakeholders coming to the playtest. This has, I imagine, like no intersection with the work you're doing currently. I'm sorry about that. But persuasiveness is necessarily a trait we have to explore, so I'm going to make you think about it. The best way to convince people that there is a problem that needs fixing is to show them the impact of that problem in a way that they cannot disagree with. Watch this person for an hour or whatever struggle with the thing you've designed. Watch them, sit there and watch them do that thing. So we should do everything we can to have playtests, to have stakeholders attend the sessions in person. So things like building a narrative around attendance, make it a cool event day, put up the posters. You know, manipulate people and get them in the lab, get them watching. You know, I've heard teams about baking cookies. I've heard teams serving beer. There's people that bring pizza, the people that make it a party. Bungie have talked about the fact they have a theatre, they make it fun, all the team comes down and they watch the playtest. Like, do whatever is necessary to get people to come and watch the sessions, get off of their seats doing other important stuff, and get them in the sessions. Is so impactful on the persuasiveness of the data and for cultural change that's necessary by respecting that data. Important for building empathy. You're all very empathetic people. That's why you're here in this room, because you want to make a career out of empathetic research. Not to propose that other people are less empathetic, but sometimes encouraging scenarios where they can find some empathy is important. All right. Yes, go on.
What about video?
It's just no one's going to watch it. It's just no one has got time. It's just not as exciting as being there. I know it's a bias. It's obviously a bias. Of course, it's just as persuasive. Should be just as persuasive in a video of that thing as it is watching on the screen in real time. But it's just not. It's just something. It's like a nice. Oh, yeah, I'll watch it. Of course, I'll just watch the video. Right. Realistically, people are too busy. So baking cookies can be the thing that gets them over the hill to get them into the lab. Oh yeah. But drunk playtests are a thing, so don't. Yeah, just don't. I don't want to be dismissive. Of course, it's important to record everything. We deliver all the videos, and I'm sure people go through them with a fine-tooth comb. It's just not the same. It's just not the same, is it? It's the only. Oh, go on.
And don't stakeholders want to see more?
I don't know. Do you like hearing people telling your baby's ugly? I don't know. It's not nice to have your the thing you've slaved over be torn apart, and especially if there are other persuasiveness problems in that scenario, which I'm going to come to now. But no, not always. Remarkably, you'd be surprised how few sessions get attended with player research. Less than half, I'd say, which is an embarrassing circumstances. I spent a lot of time building beautiful labs and beautiful observations, soundproofed observation spaces. I'd love for developers to attend more, but you know, I need to serve more cookies, I guess. Yeah, pipe in some local beers or something. I don't know. It's a continued frustration, but I understand people are busy. Okay. Oh, I was going to say, it's the only thing I like about one-way mirrors. Do you have those here? Got my foot in. Do you have one there? Okay, good. One way.
We have one in Stratford.
Okay, sorry. But they are awful in every way. But they are really good for building empathy. It's much different to actually look at someone versus watching them on a screen or looking at their face through a video camera for the same reasons. It's sort of a bit distancing. They're a bit old-fashioned now, but they are remarkable for building empathy. There's other reasons I don't like them. You have to be quiet on the near side of them, right? And it has to be dark. I'm just fussy. Okay. Persuasiveness. I talked about sample sizes a bit already. How do we make data more persuasive? Small sample sizes. Nielsen's 5. Nielsen says that we can have 5 users and it's going to be enough to tell us about 80% of issues. Wicked, thanks. That's awesome research. Amazing, thank you. Even if 5 users is enough to get the data we need, is it enough to get the good data we need? Right? And I can tell you now that companies on the lower end of the maturity spectrum will not consider 5 users to be enough to convince them to make changes to the game that cut through every mechanic, every aspect for every user. It's just simply too risky, or like too much dissonance there, or it's just not persuasive enough. So I'm not proposing that you run what's termed as research theatre, where you run research for the sake of looking like you're running research, or you're running redundant research for the sake of, I don't know, wasting time. But there is a component of the success of your research that requires you to consider whether or not the sample size you've got is rigorous, actionable, on time, and persuasive. Is running bad research? Bad research is bad. Good research that gets ignored is as bad research. I'll just leave that to you lot. I'm well aware that this is like a bias, right? People don't trust science, or the data they don't. The data is perfectly rigorous, but they don't want to trust it. But they're real and they're every day, and they affect people. You have to take that in mind. When I was writing this slide, I was thinking about airport terminals. There's no Terminal 13. No airport, I don't know, I'm sure you can find an airport from Terminal 13 if you Google it. But airports don't have Terminal 13s, because 13 is an unlucky number. What nonsense is that? 13 is an unlucky, that's obviously stupid. Like, there's no such thing. You think 5,000 engineers that were involved in that terminal being constructed think that 13 is an unlucky number? No, obviously not. But there's still no Terminal 13. Sometimes it's just important to consider persuasiveness, and important to consider the worst order consequence of what you're doing, and just making sometimes counterintuitive, uncomfortable, sample size changes. What's a sample size change? What is removing Terminal 13? Nothing. What's adding an extra 5 people to your sample size? Nothing. There's no value to be found in keeping the sample size minimum. So they're minimums, they're not limits, is what I'm getting at. Okay? And there's lots of reasons. No one likes doing redundant research, but making bad games is much worse. Alright. This is the slide that I was excited to show you earlier. We were talking about, I can't remember the question actually, but it was something about what is persuasive, along the lines of what is persuasive. Here's what's persuasive, in my opinion. This is the sort of data that people trust if they don't really understand what games user research is about, or they've got no appreciation for sample size minimums. Let's go through them first, and then I want to talk about how you should use these. Because this is obviously a very touchy subject. Here's what's persuasive. People saying things out loud. I don't like this game, it's not good, I won't buy it. Is significantly more persuasive than someone demonstrating the equivalent in their behaviour. Right? Big data. Having 10,000 players is better than 10. No, what are you talking about? You don't want to play test with 10,000 players is better than 10. Right? Big data is significantly more persuasive. It's not a bad thing. It is persuasive. High specificity or literalness. With games, a lot of what we're looking at is analogues to fun behaviours, or things that we think will be fun when they're finished, right? But that's like an abstraction. It's a series of things you have to believe. Like example, a series of things that have to happen in a row before we get to fun. But players doing things literally, like literally bumping into walls, literally getting stopped, literally blocking the game, literally putting the controller down, or being very highly specific with their actions or their words is significantly more persuasive than trying to abstract or run off on a tangent from their behaviour into how it might impact the whole cohort. Players with high value players, people that have paid a lot of money, people that have played 10,000 hours, esports players, people that have high profiles in the industry, streamers, they are very persuasive. Biometrics and anything that's new fancy, the idea of cutting straight through what players say and straight into their bodies and hearts and minds, that's very persuasive. Anything new fancy is cool, like AI and machine learning stuff, very fancy. Actual game developers' opinions, anything the developers say rather than, anything developers themselves say rather than listening to players is much very persuasive. An individual player's story, like game developers are very empathetic people, as are we, so hearing someone talk about their story or them retelling things that they've done and the emotions that they had, that's very persuasive. Anything that's predictive, like mathematically or otherwise. Anything directly tied to money, i.e. in-app purchase or PI purchase intent, like I won't buy this, or some measure of whether or not people will buy things, and also focus groups. very persuasive, because there's people talking. It's like all of these things. People saying things out loud and much bigger data. You know. Cool. All right. This is like a cheat sheet for persuasive data. I don't really know what you're going to do with this. I mean, you should use this. Take this, recognize it, understand how this intersects with the rigorousness of your project or your data, and make good data out of it. How do these lead to good data? That's the question to ask. Clearly, this intersects with this idea of research theatre, where we're doing research that looks like research and sounds like research, but it's either leading to nothing or leading to bad data. Research theatre. I don't condone that. And what I do want to be very clear is that player research, we've made very, very deliberate choices to not engage with any of this, because we choose to. You decide. This is for your professional conscience to decide what to do. Player research doesn't run focus groups. We don't run, well, at the moment we don't do biometrics for lots of reasons that are separate from their efficacy. We focus on behavioural data where we can. We try to avoid individual player narratives in our reports and try and focus on behavioural data. We're very careful about discussions of IAPs. We're exceptionally careful to control research sample sizes, and because I'm the boss, I get to decide the projects we work on and don't. And I won't work on anything. I won't engage with a client that I think wants research theatre. You may find your future careers differ, and you may find more or less agency in your future careers. I don't know. Here's one for you to think about. Okay. So many questions now. I'm so excited. Go.
So you listed biometrics and legitimacy as a way to persuade.
Yes.
I don't know what you mentioned, like it's not something you apply to a project, but have you noticed that maybe through from others that it is a way that people trust this type of data?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I should really look at the at some point. We can talk about that as well. But maybe that'll be my point, and you can both count it. Biometrics, and then as well, of course. Biometrics are useful, valid, powerful, interesting tools. If anything, I think they probably suffer from a bit too much persuasiveness. And that if you're low UX maturity, you don't understand things like mixed methods. Or if you're coming at a stage in the development process where the insight that biometrics can inform, you're not ready to action, then that's a danger. And there's a risk that your attention is drawn to. Biometry is also good at certain research questions, but bad at others. No one's dived up here to stage dive and take the mic, so I'm not saying it's at least you disagree with there's experts in the field, no, I'm certainly not. They're very persuasive, and it has to be considered in how they're used. And at the moment, my position on it is that they are, whilst I am ready to use them to make better games.
So what's keeping you away from exploring that?
So I'm ready to use them to make better games.
Okay.
Like, player research is ready with the tools and the methods and the experts, but development studios themselves, I don't think they're quite ready for that level of persuasiveness and to be injected into their development processes yet. It's pretty mean, isn't it? It's pretty patronising. Sorry, game developers.
No, it's something we've discussed to our research.
Do you want to counterpoint on any of those? I feel like
I have to go first, and then I'm going to tell you my opinion as well.
Why don't you start? Honestly, like I'm running a stream here. I wasn't paying attention last 5 minutes. Sorry.
I think I actually agree. I mean, I spend my PhD looking at biometrics and user research particularly, but so there are a couple of things. One is, would you use that to identify more issues? And if can they identify more issues? We wrote a paper together, and then we said they can. Would it worth the effort to use biometrics to identify more issues?
Yeah.
I'd probably say not.
Right, and that's an on-time thing than accessibility.
Yeah.
That's not a real persuasive.
And then can they be used to persuade developer to leave?
Mm-hmm.
I agree they can be, and I think that's, if I want to summarize my thesis in like a few lines, that would be the summary, that if you struggle to find a way to convince the developer, but then you can apply an environment to show them how their player's body react to the thing, that's actually quite good. Mm-hmm. I actually like what you mentioned here about, because sometimes I think as a user researcher, personal opinion, you need to also be careful that maintain those stuff, because there could be a case, and I don't remember, I think we were on the project, I'm not going to mention the game because it's being recorded, but we had a project, and then we had a player who came and then we play tested with her, and she was like, I hate this game, it's crap, it's really bad. And then we had like 12 players or whatever, and she was really, really negative. And for the second round, the developers were like, bring that player back, we want to hear from her again. And I think as a user researcher, you also need to be careful that maybe that player is too persuasive for something that doesn't matter, but it kind of distract developers on focusing on the more important stuff, where they hear someone say, oh, the art stuff is really bad, I don't hate it, I hate it. And that's a one person opinion, but because she was very loud, she was like, oh, this is the worst game I've played, they were too focused on her. So that's kind of my take on this.
Skip the slide. I'm just going to point at this. This. Go ahead.
So that phenomenon that you're talking about,
yeah.
People are more interested in individual stories or
yeah.
anecdotes. Would that be very similar to the Reddit phenomenon?
I think so, yeah. Let's talk about Reddit. Oh, great exercise. Let's put Reddit on here. So let's map Reddit to this. I'm not proposing this is thorough, by the way. I wrote this in, pretty quickly. It's not. I'm sure there's other things I could have used here. So Reddit is faux big data, right? Because you've got numbers, upvotes. But it's obviously not the whole cohort. People saying things out loud, obviously. They can often be very specific. I imagine. I'm not an expert on this, but one imagine that Reddit has got actually quite high game design literacy. They can use there's a lot of like armchair game designers, for want of a better phrase, right? They can use the phrases game designers use, and they can give very specific cutting feedback that sounds familiar. That maybe they're high value players, they've probably already got the game. They can tell their own individual stories, and of course everyone talks about whether or not they're going to buy and blah blah blah. So yeah, like Reddit maps this pretty well in terms of highly persuasive data. Let's be clear, there's good research inside every one of these factors. Any of these can be harnessed for good, and can also be harnessed for evil. So you have to make those choices.
I have a question now. So I got most of the point. I'm not sure can you explain how would you use, if you have to, that high value player's opinion,
sure,
as well as actual game developer's opinion? Would you mean that you invite them to play the game and tell you what they think?
So this is done all the time with big spenders. So, for example, how much of this is public? So I know that this is definitely public. So Supercell, for example, have Clash of Clans makers, biggest game in the world for a long time, have a customer support team dedicated to their high value players. Right? They are specifically aligned for keeping those players well served by the company. Also feeding their data back into the studio.
I see. So like they have a new feature, they ask them to come and
sure, yeah, why not?
Okay.
Oh yeah, you can definitely, you should definitely explore this. This is also people like esports, players, very, very high skill players. It's not all about money, but of course, game development.
So would you use them as part of, would be your kind of a tester, play tester? You would bring
yeah, sure. Well, it would change over the course of development. So what would you do? In the inspiration stage, you could bring them in to form player personas or spender personas. You could ask them for a perspective on, there's a lot of studios working with Reddit moderators and that sort of thing to try and engage the community. There's even community managers that do this sort of role. You can inspire game design at that stage with their stories. What should we make?
How about the game developer opinion? Do you mean like from other studios you bring like developers and then...
There's no escaping this. I mean, when I say playtest, quite often playtest is mistaken as game developers giving each other feedback, right?
Yeah.
Playtest days and like playtesting each other's games.
Yeah.
It's very, very persuasive because they're experts in games.
So basically, other developers play each other's game.
And this is like mock reviews as well, and speaking to journalists, that sort of thing. doing previews, private previews of games. So maybe not game developers, but also people around.
Yeah,
you can also talk about
being
consultants.
persuasive doesn't necessarily equal to collecting good data.
No, well, no, not all persuasive data is good data, but all good data is persuasive data.
Yeah.
Persuasive isn't, you cannot separate, in my opinion, persuasiveness from all other aspects of considering religion and religion. Go ahead.
But how much value can you really place in like pro players' opinion? Because not to sound disparaging of the player base on average, but like pro players are capable of pulling off more intricate things, especially in like a high complexity game. They're capable of more complicated combos, for example.
Sure.
And the average player is probably not even going to discover the fact that you can change it.
Sure. So how else do you get that data then, I guess? If you're designing a game for that audience, but there's only 100 people in that audience, I mean, there's no one else to speak to. I guess you could, as a game designer, you could make lots of assertions about how to design, for example, a combat system or a balanced mobile or something. But there simply must be information you can garner from that group in a rigorous way to bring back into the development process. I've not worked in that space. I have done expert interviews of players, so people that are the very high upper echelons of skill set. We've interviewed world record holders and top 100 in the world players for different projects. You're right, the insight you can garner is very thin, but it's razor sharp, right? You can make very specific choices that cater specifically for that audience if you're controlling the flow of data. Would I design my whole game around them? No. Would I use it as part of inspirational feedback as part of a wider picture of the data I'm collecting? Oh yeah, hell yes. That sounds really impactful. Go ahead.
The thing you mentioned about Supercell, do you yourself have can identify some type of users that aren't necessarily experts but have great taste, and you can just have them do the tests and
that mentality is much more aligned with the market research mentality. Maintaining, let's say, a cohort of influencers or tastemakers, trying to parse that group. That's a very old market research method, and largely market research departments I think are responsible for that. I don't know, I don't work with the market research department. Theoretically, could one identify individuals that are kind of predictors of success? I don't know, that sounds like nonsense, but maybe. Is that what your question was? Can you measure 400 people and predict for 4 billion?
For example, when you're developing apps, there are some people who might have good instincts of maybe things if it's going to work or not.
Sure.
They would be great people to give your beta versions to test. So this is I'm wondering if you as a game researcher would look for these kind of people to.
Me, no. I've no interest in their black science, this dark science of predicting because I think it's about right in the market. Like market analysis and that sort of thing by consultants. I'm sure it's a discipline unto itself, but I'm a science guy. I'm a real guy. I'm a measuring people guy. I'm a conducting rigorous research guy. I don't think there's anything about research there that's just slightly more educated guessing on their part. Arrogant guessing. I'm sure there's a space for that in game development, but it's not something I've touched on.
Do influencers have a bias? Most of them, most famous players from eSport, they have a contract with specific studios. They can't test other.
I'm going to opt out of answering that because I simply cannot. I don't interact at all with the influencer space. Are they biased? Yes, I propose that they are. Are they ungeneralizable? Yes, I would propose so. Doesn't mean that they can't give us something. I'd like to be the person who's in control of that data. I wouldn't mind. I think you should pick a game user researcher to decide what data you should get from influencers, but I've not done that. I do think community management as a discipline, which is on the rise. So community managers, individuals in game studios responsible for social media outreach, marketing and generation, are a principally untapped resource for good research. But they largely have not been employed from research backgrounds. So they may be, I think there's an opportunity there for collaboration with community teams to touch on some of those subjects harness Reddit for the greater good, harness influencers for effective, rigorous, actionable, on-time decision. But it's outside, personally, it's outside of my remit and her research remit right now. I'd like to move in that direction. Sounds quite exciting.
So my question then is, you probably heard about Ubisoft's perceived, what is it called?
Can I say something I regret about Ubisoft?
Yeah, no, it's live, so let's go there. Ubisoft Perceived Experience Questionnaire, the UPEC, or UPEC, that Alessandro was working on at Massive, right? And so they recently released, a nice little social media stuff, blog post, a really cool video that shows their machine learning prediction. Very fancy, very good looking, massive. Massive. So the thing here is it's a lot of gameplay data validated with survey data. At least that's how I'm understanding it. And then they have this algorithm that learns competence, autonomy, relatedness, and presence of the player at any given point in the game. This would fall, I think, into your new fancy that you have in here.
Just to say it's bad, none of these things are bad.
No, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just like, how believable is it once this stuff becomes a bit more of a black box, and you're now the company is trusting the research team to deliver this kind of stuff. Like I personally, as a researcher, I think it's absolutely amazing that we have this stuff available, and you couldn't be doing research in a better time than this, where you have multiple teams around the world all working on these player experience questions, using computers to make these prediction algorithms better. That's really a great time to be alive, but how useful is it to you on a day-to-day?
Well, I don't know because I haven't worked with it, but I do know how I'd measure it, and it's this lot, right? They're not very smart people, and I trust them to know that they're thinking about these 4 metrics. It sounds like, by your account, I'm not familiar, but I think I've read one of the papers. It's by inherently, because of the subject we just talked about, it's exceptionally persuasive. It's clearly should be very rigorous if it's been validated and it's using a lot of player data, etc. And then we're left with the consideration of our middle 2, of how quickly can that be garnered, how many players does one have to run through it, when in the development process is that data likely to be made available at a time and cost which is compatible with a fast-moving development environment and a limited budget, and the insight that it generates, how likely is it to manifest in clear, actionable, deliberate change? Now, I could ask you maybe, I don't know, there's no scoring here, but perhaps you could score these or something like that. It's clear that all methods, though, any new method is going to score lower than some of these at the start, right? So did biometrics, so did eye tracking, so did any new tool, so did I could think of more examples, give them more time. Iteration on the research method itself will improve it, but we have to start somewhere. Which is not to say I don't know anything about this product. I'm sure maybe it's already files across the board.
In this case, you, however, already know the research method. What if you just hired this young researcher? They have ties to academia. All of a sudden, one day to the next, they come into your office Monday morning saying, "Hey, my old team just found out this cool thing." Like, is that something that could even, would that even fly with a client at that point? Because it's rigorous, it's on time. Maybe it's useful for your study this week.
Yeah, why not? Certainly not. If I should stick behind the model I've delivered. If it meets all of these criteria, then it should be a tool in our arsenal. Again, though, there isn't some sort of upper cap. We've talked about this. Where perhaps with biometrics, data is so persuasive, a 10 on the scale of persuasiveness overwhelms the low scores on the others. Actually, it risks strategically or operationally inside the business being misused or manipulated for evil purposes, for want of a better phrase. So yeah, there's no separating, which is why one can't just simply consider rigor in terms of, validate it all day long. Run all your studies with the biggest samples you like, unless we're considering the potential social, financial, strategic impacts of what we're doing, then there are other variables, other failures that may occur down the line. But it takes time. It takes time to work that out, and hopefully not a negative impact on the product. I don't know if I feel like maybe spun around your question. Certainly not now.
No, I think you're right. I agree with you that oftentimes actionable is actually one of the things that is a thing that we're lacking very often, and I have trouble teaching that. So you could.
Yeah, it's tough. It is tough. So we're still sort of in the realms of the article with John Hobson in 2003, where he says, "We're not listening." Maybe you can send around for me, where he talks about how academic research is fundamentally disconnected from the realities of game development. And I wouldn't propose. I don't know whether things have changed. You tell me. If this is nothing I've told you in the last few hours, you think is important, or you thought about all this before, then maybe John was right then, and he's no honest, or we fix everything. But anyway. Go ahead.
So we talked a lot about this idea of you can do evil with the persuasive techniques.
Yeah.
But in your experience, which side does it err on more? Are people not persuasive enough, or are they too persuasive for things that are not?
Oh, great question. I feel I'd have to make some sweeping generalizations that make it unkind, but I'll do it anyway because I'm on the spot and on camera. What do I want to say? Broadly speaking, I don't think games user researchers are good enough at talking about the value they deliver to projects and being persuasive, either in the moment or in retrospect, about the impact that they have. As a discipline, we have to work on that. Return on investment for UX is very hard to measure. So it's very hard to say, I made that thing that made us 10 times more money. So it's tough to be persuasive because you really can't tie anything in user research back to money. It's very tough. That probably should be first on the list. There are certainly other teams inside games doing research, not just games user researchers, market research departments and business intelligence departments, and all sorts of other teams trying to work out influencer stuff and social media metrics and all sorts of other stuff. Do I think that they're all doing rigorous, actionable data that's on time? No. Do I think it's very persuasive? Yes, because of these reasons. I couldn't possibly generalise to all game teams at all times. Do I think there's room for everyone to increase the rigorousness of the work they do? Yes. You're skirting all the questions today. I'm sure I answered that one for you. Games user, if I could talk about games user research, which I probably should stick to my own discipline rather than making sweeping generalisation, I'd like us to be better at being more persuasive. And I'd like us to do so honourably, truthfully.
And is part of this maybe also tie back to the maturity issue, that we need to be more persuasive now because of the lack of maturity?
Sure.
And if it was more maturity, we wouldn't have to.
Yeah, I think maturity begets persuasiveness, and persuasiveness begets maturity. There's more mutual respect for what we do and how we live. Okay, I'm going to move on because otherwise. One final point on this, if I may. These are dangerous. Have I said that enough times? As a company policy, it's in our culture document. It's in the rules that define who we are as individuals inside operating together. There is a page that says, no bullshit. That is a company policy, no bullshit. Because we know that this stuff needs to be talked about. And I'm proposing you talk about it too. I propose you think about it, and think about who you are, the research team that you're joining, talk to your employers about this, talk about in your job interviews about this. Tell me, refine your ability to tell whether a company's own culture about persuasiveness. Because I propose that some of this is tied to job satisfaction and impact. Okay? Cool. All right, we're going to do some real fast stuff. Holy moly, this is more than I thought. We're going to go on to sample sizes. The first thing you're going to be critiqued for is your sample size, and the second thing is who the players are. So get up in front of that problem. Obviously, you only ever use real players, obviously. Prepare counterpoints for cohort criticism, so why are we using these players? What are they designed to tell us? Why are we not using people that only bought our game? Why are we not only speaking to expert players? You're going to have to change the types of players you speak to depending on your research method. For example, if you're testing a tutorial, you probably want to skew more naive. You want people that have not played a game like this before, maybe, to test the efficacy of the tutorial. Can we teach people to play this new type of game? Why are we speaking to people that will never buy our game? Right? Persuasiveness challenge. Well, be ready, prepare counterpoints. Always have a spare playtester handy, always. So we run reserves every single day to make sure we've got, if there's a person that's out, we run on small sample sizes because we want to run quickly. So if we've got a playtester that doesn't meet the spec, for some reason they're not meeting the criteria we think is essential, we've always got a reserve player to run and we'll strip that player's data out of the test. Recruit a truly diverse cohort. Somebody mentioned playtester diversity already. There's some really good data from Google, which I'm so pleased that they published, that talks about how gender and age is a really poor predictor of what games people will like and play. So when I'm talking about diverse, I'm talking not just about gender and age, but also mainly about motivation. So where it benefits your research, make sure you're recruiting a truly diverse cohort and understanding what diversity means to your research question. Yeah, so actually there's an example I wanted to give here. Oh, this was an example from Paradox. They gave, they talked about it at a conference. They streamed Paradox, a games company based in Europe. They were getting pushback, they said, on their playtester cohorts. Why are we testing with these players? This is players in our target market. So they started on the streams, putting the player data, putting how many of the Paradox games that they had played and they paid for, or whatever, or how many DLCs they bought. And they added the questions to the research as well. Like at the start of the session, they'll be like, well, how many, what games have you played? It wasn't needed, it wasn't necessary, but it was an effort to make things more persuasive. This is our player. Maybe they're not who you think they are, but they've given you money, they value, their opinion has value. They just got ahead of those criticisms by making operational change. Okay. Case studies are important. I've skipped a couple because they're not important. Just case studies, be ready with examples like I've been trying to give today about how you make data more persuasive if you're thinking about it, and be ready to show case studies of your own work as soon as you can generate it. And I've already talked about this. Go to where developers are. So, I mean, my example earlier was that they're in the toilets. You should probably go there. But also, don't wait for dev teams to come to you. You know, if you're going to try and change a company's culture, you need to go out to them and speak to them. Yeah, there's, as I've proposed already, there's very little institutional knowledge and respect for games user research outside the top 10 or 20 studios. That's your challenge. That's the rest of your career is going to be spent fixing that. If you like me, think it's important. So get out there and evangelize. Get out there and start talking about games user research. All right. Good data in summary. This makes good data. It's a combination of both the methods you choose, the context of development, and the deliverables you choose to construct and how you communicate those to the team. I want you to think about what concessions you should make in each of these categories every time you're making strategic choices about research. If you're not considering all of these things, then there's a risk you're not generating good data, which makes your work valueless to the team and makes everybody sad and miserable. So, yeah, very important. And I did all these slides like it already, so I'm going to skip it. And I think that might be it. Thanks very much. Wait. What do you want to do?
Maybe we can have question and answer, please.
If that's okay?
Yes,
Lunch is there, so we'll do that.
I'm going to have a question. Here as in cold, or here as in?
Here in the other room, it'll wait 10 minutes if everyone has some questions and we'll go over there and ask one.
All right, I'm keeping you from your lunch, so they have to be good questions. Go ahead. Oh, do you want to go?
Question again.
So good question.
At the beginning of the day,
Yes.
at the beginning, you said about the kind of maturity as well as kind of persuasive that kind of go together. You said there are many great games out there that is there, but they don't know about user research and stuff like that. So how would you argue the value of user research where it's proven that you can make great game without doing any user research?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's this sort of weird fallacy that games user research is only responsible for making good stuff. Well, it's actually much more important is the making. More than the good, just as much as the good stuff that comes out is how long it took you to make it. How much money, how much uncertainty, how many staff did you burn through, how much risk was there, how many other projects did you prevent from happening. Regrettably, what makes our life hard is that game studios can't recognise it. Because we didn't have this insight then, we made bad decisions. No one has that level of introspection where they can go back over 2 or 3 years of development and go like, oh, I made 5 or 10 different bad decisions and I had to unwind them. It takes a lot of introspection. It's very hard to just determine what of my time I've wasted. Like to say, oh, I wasted 2 months there, 3 months there. Now, that makes it very hard to talk about value for money. I touched on this earlier, UX is hard to quantify your return on investment in UX. So in answer to your point, yes, there are good games. Games user research helps make good games. So we can't just focus on that, we have to focus on the making, not just the game. Or we'll never win this argument of the trusted developers who believe that they can make a good game. And they're right, they can make a good game given enough time. It's the time we're going to shrink, not necessarily don't have to up the quality of the final product. Is that a cheese answer? Probably. But I think it's important.
So how do you tackle more controversial elements when communicating your research, like loot boxes?
Yeah, great question, especially poignant at the moment. So talking about loot boxes. Firstly, loot boxes in particular, but also most of these mechanics are closely tied to the game design intent, which is already a remit which we are not touching. So to some extent it's making sure that I'm drawing a line around what we can talk about, and then the decisions about the business model of the game, for example, are outside of our remit. Now I can inform those studios about the effect, let's say, of the loot boxes with rigorous data. But it makes it essentially much more important that we control expectations of what we're going to talk about with a development studio. Now, as a company, we've made our own choices about what we'll talk about and what we won't, the sort of feedback we'll give, and the sort of research we'll run, and the sort of products we'll work on. I could talk about that off or on camera, I'm not sure. But they're a clearly very controversial subject in game development today. Crunch, as we already talked about, loot boxes, gambling, variable rewards, free to play. I don't think we should be scared of talking about those, but we must do so in a way that matches all of our criteria. What does it mean to be rigorous to talk about loot boxes? What does it mean to manage one's persuasiveness when talking about loot boxes? So again, I guess it's the skill of the individual researcher in maintaining a confident narrative, competence, and remit in a professional environment. So yeah, down to the individual, I'm afraid, I think, down to one's individual control.
So, in the case of your company, you guys are more neutral or more like niche or more specifically, because since it involves edge case? So
sure. So broadly speaking, we're proponents of player-centric, what we call player-centric monetization, which means monetization of a game that is done with the player's consent in a way that's constructive and, for example, doesn't try and trick players out of money or uses things called dark patterns. And that cuts almost 99% of the conversations of this is cut away. There's a lot of problems with free-to-play games being deliberately deceptive. And so we don't agree with that, and that's the feedback we give. It's better to be honest with one's players. As a company, we make a choice not to work on gambling games, although that is based on the consultants that work at the company currently. That may change in the future. I'm not proposing it doesn't. But it's based on we're a collective of games user researchers, actually. That's how I view our business. So we make decisions together as a business. So yeah, I actually don't have to have that many conversations of the topics you propose. Also, I'd suggest that the companies that come to player research are those, the businesses that come to us, are the ones that are interested in making, who share our perspective on player-centric monetization, or doing so I don't know if I have an adjective here actually, it's not dismissive, but doing so in a way that we can all agree would be a better way of making money from video games. I cannot speak on behalf of all the researchers at Player Research. We're a group of consultants whose opinion individually I respect greatly. I speak only for myself in this case. But as a collective, we make our own decisions on what work games we work on, how we talk about them, and the moral standards, the moral platform we stand upon. But you should make your own decisions. Everyone here should make their own decisions. Go ahead.
I just have a question. Do you ever sort of, once you analyze the data, you kind of like put it together to make like a persona of a person instead of?
Yeah, it's not something we've done too much. It's very, so yes, why don't we do it that much? Two reasons. One, market research have they do personas, so they're already sort of used around game development. They're also really bad in general. They're not data driven, they're mostly demographic focused, they're like mostly based on in-app purchase behaviour and principally not useful for making design decisions. So there's already competition for this persona space because they have their own. That's first. Second, because game studios often come to player research near the end of the development cycle because they've already made a lot of mistakes and kind of probably in a bit of a hole, which isn't true of all of our studios, but you know, they come to us for a reason. They are there's no need for a persona because we've made a lot of choices already. So there's no need for a persona in that case. But yes, we have written them. They're really powerful and a much underutilized tool. They're also very complicated when you start talking about motivations of players. I'll defer back to that, Roger. I'll defer back to that Google article that says demographics. It's called Who Plays Games. It's posted on the Google Play blog. It's a PDF written by Alan Bevans, who's wonderful, and it talks about how demographics, gender and age, etc., are very poor predictors of what people will play. So it's evident that these market research personas they're not useful tools because they simply don't represent cohorts of your market, like demarcated cohorts, which is what personas are supposed to do. Okay? Go.
Probably last question for both we go for lunch.
Sure.
And I wanted to talk about this before, since we have everyone together in the room. I want you to, it's a slightly different topic, but I want you to talk about what do you look for when you are hiring new staff for your team. So it is all going to graduate soon, and what can they do with the time they have at the university to make their profile more competitive, let's say, for you to hire them? Oh, you included that.
I wrote this last night based on our conversation at about 11:30. I'll be really fast because I know you're going to lunch. You've also almost certainly had enough of me preaching at you for the last 2 hours, and that's fine, I understand. I'm going to reach peak preacher now, and I'm sorry for that. But if you'll forgive me, I wrote slides and everything. I enjoyed our conversation last night, and I'm not going to miss this opportunity to give you the advice I wish I had had when I was sitting in your seat. Is that allowed? I know I'm keeping you from lunch. So rude of me. I'm very sorry. All right, we'll do this real fast. One. I'm sorry that I made this in the slides. It already feels
actually good.
All right, top tips for not wasting your time. Because I just so enjoyed our conversation. One. Come on. Stop comparing yourself to anyone like your potential. When I was in your place, a lot of my peers around me would look to other people and be like, well, how much work are they doing? What's that team doing? Like, how do we beat them? It's very poor. It's going to result in you not reaching your own individual potentials. So stop it. If you want to compare yourself, target the best person in your class and only them. Because they're the person, if you need to beat someone, they're the only person to beat. I saw a lot of people waste their own potentials by letting other people drag them down, being like, I'm just going to do better than that guy, better than that lady, whatever, and staying down here. I'll read fast, I promise, I know you won't too much. I wish someone had told me this, that my degree, your degree should be the least valuable thing that you do here. Everyone is going to leave this room with a degree, every one of you. Cool, that's great. Doesn't make you more employable or less employable than anyone else, with respect. I want you to make this your goal. That the degree should be the bottom thing on your CV. It should be the least proud thing you've done. What does that mean for you? I don't know yet, you decide. But I think this should be true for all of you. It's not enough to set your targets at just enough. Number 3, opportunities don't make themselves. I made opportunities with Dr. Pesman when he was a PhD student at Sussex. I made that, he was gracious enough to give me in return a lot of opportunities, but I made them by working hard and being around and being keen. And here I am talking to you. They don't make themselves, so get out there and speak to people. Speak to your peers, speak to lecturers. This is the most free you'll ever be in your entire lives to make connections for the last few years of your professional careers. You're going to be surrounded by people like me and people like these three. Make most of it now. Start your habits now. I wasted so much time. I wish I had spent more time reading when I was in your shoes. I wasted so much time not reading around the subject, and now I'm having to catch up, especially around things about project management, around wellness, around writing, around constructive thought and mental models. I'm aware that this conversation is unlikely to have manifest a massive difference in any of your lives, but if there's a small chance I can get you to read an extra book a year, to build a habit in your life of reading and caring about yourselves, then maybe I should. It's my responsibility to stand up here and tell you that. Feed the love of reading, make time to look after yourselves, and keep a list of things you don't understand. Keep a list of things you feel like you don't get, and then constantly add to it, and then try and check things up. And 5, it's going to be a tough ride. I didn't know how to phrase this when I was writing this last night. I don't even know if this is the right thing to tell you, but I'm going to do it anyway. Some of you are not going to get jobs in Cambridge research. There's not enough roles and there's too many bright people. It's going to be tough. None of you are going to walk straight into few of you are going to walk straight into a Cambridge research role. Don't let that define you. It's your job to find. If you really give a shit about this discipline and you want to work in it, I applaud you and it's great. Come work with us as a group. It's cool. There's lots of work to be done. Chances are you probably won't get straight into a job. Don't let that define you. Find adjacent roles, find work experience, be hungry, go and find an internship, go and find a UX role in mainstream, go and build yourselves and be better, because it's going to be a tough ride, but it works. I don't know if the narrative has been sown that you're going to walk straight into jobs, but let me break that immediately. There's a lot of demand. I interviewed 50 researchers last year for 2 positions, and I didn't fill them. Right? There's a lot of people out there that want this role. It's going to be tough. Fine, but you're strong people who will. Okay. I didn't write any more slides, but what have I not covered in what you wanted me to say about getting a job? What do I look for in candidates? It's nearly lunch. Self-determinism, humbleness and humility. I mean, if you can scratch those 2 off the list, you're already going to be top of the list of candidates. More than, because those 2 things lead to all of that stuff that we talked about. Is there any subject you want me to cover specifically?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. You want lunch? I don't blame you. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you very much.